My name is Kibona Clark, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. My area of specialization is really looking at popular culture representation, especially looking at hip-hop as a tool of social commentary and looking at the way that women in Africa especially have used it as a way to really push back against patriarchy and sexism and misogyny. I'm also a photographer, and I am a host and producer of the African hip hop blog and podcast. So I was born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and I moved to the U.S. when I was 5 years old. I've been here ever since, gone back and forth, but I've been living in the U.S. ever since. My mother, who's African American, a lot of her friends were also African American women specifically, and men in some cases, who had moved to Tanzania, because it was during a time when a lot of African Americans were moving to Africa. Several had moved to Tanzania. There were some who, had gone to Ghana until the time that Nkrumah was overthrown, but many of them had moved to Ghana. And so Tanzania became like a hub. In many ways, the way Ghana is now, but Tanzania was like a hub for many. And, during that time period, you also had the Pan-African Congress that took place in Dar es Salaam. So you had all of these people who were in Tanzania. And so I do remember lots of kids. There were maybe only a handful of people that stayed, but most people ended up leaving. My mother, being very kind of headstrong, Black feminist that she is, said, no, I'm taking a child, we're going back to the States. And there have been times, I wish we would have stayed, primarily because I think the language issue is what I regret the most about us leaving, because my Swahili is just not that good. Tanzania especially, our identity is very much tied to the language. And if you're a Tanzanian and you don't speak Swahili, it's it's very difficult. And I know that, I understand that, and I don't push back against it because it's I believe it. I believe in it. So it's a struggle for me because if you're in a space that's predominantly Tanzanian, Swahili is going to be the language. So it's not just about, people speaking Swahili on the street. It's people speaking Swahili in the government building names are in Swahili. And so it is something that, Tanzania has been very rightly so proud of, because Swahili doesn't belong to any ethnic group. So it is also something that unites all Tanzanians. So you have Swahili, but then you also have your ethnic group. I do think in terms of Africa in general, I am very fluent in terms of culturally, in terms of the nuances of Tanzanian culture, of kind of understanding African culture more broadly. And so I can, I'm very comfortable pretty much anywhere on a continent. And the only areas that I have that issue is when I am dealing with trying to speak Swahili. So I think one of the things that as a community we are having to deal with is many of us have come to the US or gone to Canada or gone to UK or other countries. Our children are not fluent. And so what then happens to the children? Like, we're going to have to examine that identity debate and how much Swahili is tied to our identities. And I think that's something that's going to be figured out. But I think for those of us of my generation, it is definitely still a huge part of who we are. That our children who were born in the U.S. specifically are U.S. citizens. So they have that, blue passport, and that blue passport is a passport to the world. While we're doing that, in some cases, we're also not denying them their heritage, but in some cases, depending on the country, we are not emphasizing the fact that they also need to maintain a connection. I know some families will send their children, home for the summers, in some cases to boarding school back home. I do think one of the things that's happening that I love seeing is that more and more African countries, like Ghana right now, is they have the Homeland Return Act, where they're requiring I think 2 years residence in Ghana, and then you can, get dual citizenship. But I think that in the last 15 years or so, you've had an increasing number of African countries because of so many Africans. Again, since 1985, you've had an increase in Africans coming to the U.S. specifically. So more and more African countries are realizing, look, many of our citizens are moving abroad. Many of them are, having careers abroad, having children abroad. We don't want that disconnection. So one of the things that the Ghanaians have said is, if one of your parents is Ghanaian, you're Ghanaian. If one of your grandparents is Ghanaian. You therefore have a right to Ghanaian citizenship, because we want to make sure you maintain that connection to this country. That is one of the things that I am hoping that we see more of, because I think as we're traveling, as we're moving, as we're having children, second generation, third generation, to be able to maintain that connection, I think is very crucial, because it allows us to return home. It allows our children to return home. It allows, because, my son, who is Tanzanian and Ghanaian, born here, but he in his mind is Tanzanian and Ghanaian. He does not have a Tanzanian passport. Hopefully will have a Ghanaian one soon, but he is in his mind still that. So being able to kind of maintain that allows us to travel, but still be connected home. And I think with recent years, you've seen increased mobility of African people. So we're opening ourselves up to the world. Social media is allowing us to see opportunities everywhere. We're going where there's, scholarships, where there's jobs, where there's funding, where there are other communities where we can connect with. So I think we're taking advantage of those opportunities. I think that's a good thing. When you consider the whole idea of whether or not you stay or JAPA, you need to really talk to people and have conversations and not just look at people's IG pages. When you are looking online and you're seeing people flexing, maybe they're standing in front of a Benz that's not theirs, but you don't know it's not theirs, and you're like, I must go, I must JAPA, I must do these things. And you're not stopping and looking at, but what about this person who never left? And they're good, they're comfortable, they're feeding their family, they've got their own business, they're doing their things. And you don't think about how did they do that. You're only thinking about how the person that left did that. So I think the key is to look at the person who is there, who did not leave, but is doing well. How did they do that? And let that be your mentor, let that be your guide, rather than always kind of looking at the person that left. A lot of us don't think outside the box in terms of our career goals. So, for example, right now my son wants to be a paleontologist. If he were in either Ghana or Tanzania, he would not be able to get the education he needs to be a paleontologist. He needs to be in the United States. We actually came across a Kenyan who is a professor at Stony Brook, who is a paleontologist, who wrote an article about more Africans needing to be in paleontology. And it's like, yeah, we do. So for something like that, you need to leave. In some cases, you want to be maybe a marine biologist and you are in Benin. Maybe you need to go to South Africa. South Africa probably has a good marine biology program at the University of Cape Town or one of those universities. But if you are wanting to get to a certain level, it may require you to leave. But this is after planning. And this is after knowing what you want to do, what it requires to get what you want to do, and not just saying, I want to be rich. And there's money there, so I'm going to go there and pick the money from the trees, because that's not realistic. The reality is you're going to even struggle more in many cases, and the life is not easy. It's not easy at all. The benefit of there being so many Africans that have moved to the U.S., so we know that since 1985, the African population in America has grown significantly. So every major city in America now has a significant African population. So now coming here, you're coming into an established community. Whereas if you were moving here in 1980, that wasn't the case. It was a lot harder. And in some cases, like in New York, you may even have financial institutions that are connected to financial institutions back home. Communication, we can WhatsApp call people and it sounds like they're right down the street. So it's a much easier network. But even with all of that, it can still be very difficult because you still have the issue of papers. How you get here, whether it's a tourist visa, a student visa, an immigrant visa, a work visa, or refugee status, or no status, where you just, you kind of somehow manage to get across the border without being detained. In any of those cases, your status is tied to you doing certain things. And if any of those things shift, if you're not a full-time student, you fall out of status. And then you are vulnerable for detention. So not only is your status not secure, but your ability to work is tied to your status. And so if you can't work because your status is not, let you work, then what do? You work under the table. The job you work under the table is not going to pay for your rent and your food and all of these things. So there's a lot that people don't think about in terms of cost of living. If you're living in New York City, you're out of status and you work under the table, man, it's the place you're going to be living. It's probably going to be worse than where you were living when you were back home. So there are ways, just to stay home and not have to worry about being in another country and having to deal with all the stress and trauma that brings. Finding stuff in your region. There are a lot of regional associations. You also have ECOWAS and SADC and the East African community. Looking through those associations, because oftentimes you'll find travel and work is made easier because your country is part of these associations. So yeah, I definitely would recommend that people look into those first, and they will often find that there are some really decent opportunities that they can take advantage of. But leaving the country is not really the answer, especially if you don't have a plan. In many ways, you have access to support networks that you don't have access to in America. You're here, you're considered a foreigner. You're not considered a foreigner back home. You know the system, you know how to access the system. And my position, because I'm also the director of our graduate program, I often have meetings with students who want to apply for master's degrees or PhDs in our department. And one of the things I'll ask them, do you have family or friends in the DC area? If they say no, I'm like, well, you maybe should apply to a university where you do, because you're going to have to struggle. Like, if you don't know anyone here, you probably shouldn't come to DC. And if you're not coming from a family that just has the money to just, pay for everything, it's better to go somewhere where you at least have a support system. But I think, honestly, the whole idea of JAPA, I think, is people need to really stop and look at the people around them who are doing well, who don't want to leave. There may be opportunities on the continent that you're not even considering because you're just thinking of America. There are organizations like CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. They specifically fund studying on the continent. So they really are, if you're a student studying in Africa, they provide funding for studying in Africa. They will not give you money to study outside, but their existence, and they get a lot of money from the Nordic countries, especially like Norway, Sweden. So they fund African students studying in African universities. It doesn't have to be the country that you were born in, but you need to be studying in an African university. So I guess my main advice would be to not JAPA unless you know exactly what you're doing, you have a good plan, and you've thought it through, and you have consulted individuals who know what they're talking about, and that you've decided that yes, what's best for my career or what's best for what I want to do financially is for me to go and to do these things. And you have a strong plan.